So Brett, help me understand, how can Christians, if you and I both think that movies like Noah are good, what is it that Christians have to kind of wrap their minds around? How do they have to start thinking about these movies so that they can see the good in them and not just feel all paranoid and schizophrenic about it?
Yeah. Yeah, you know, I think many Christians, especially Protestants and evangelicals, being people of the Word and kind of message-oriented, tend to look and interpret and appreciate films through the lens of, is the message clear? Is it clearly conveyed? Is it a moral message? Are there takeaways? You know, we're used to like 3-point sermons where there's clear like 3 takeaways. So I think we ask that of our films a lot of the time too. And so with a movie like Noah, it can be difficult to see what's the moral lesson, what's the takeaway, when the message isn't super clear, and that can be hard because we're so propositional oriented and we want kind of the message to be clear. So I think an approach that could maybe see a movie like Noah as valuable and as insightful and spiritually edifying is recognizing that art in general can be valuable even when it doesn't have a message to convey or a proposition to argue.
Or at least when the message isn't out in front.
When it's not out in front.
Like on a poster or something.
There can be a message and there can be a point, but oftentimes I feel like with art, it's better when there's ambiguity and when it's kind of open to interpretation and it asks the viewer to kind of fill in the gaps and make kind of judgments and interpretations themselves. I feel like it's more of an interactive thing that way rather than a clear proposition that we're just kind of, you know, we have to accept because it's clear. And I've been thinking about this with some of the other Christian movies that have been coming out recently, like Heaven is for Real and God's Not Dead. Like even the titles of those films are propositions, like heaven is for real, God is not dead. Like so I think the titles themselves reveal that the film is coming from this propositional framework where it really only cares about, we have a message, we have an argument we want to, you know, argue, and here it is. And I just don't think that works that well in narrative and in film and in art, because art is never great when it's just didactic and has a message. It's better when it invites the viewer in to kind of wrestle with it together and to kind of interpret what is going on there. And there may well be profound truth there. It doesn't mean that there's no truth or that, you know, there's nothing of value. It might involve like probing and kind of wrestling through it in a way that isn't as clear as a message-centric story.
When I'm consulting in Hollywood on films and stuff like that, one of the rules is that we always want the audience to work.
Yeah.
We want them, and what we mean by that is that we don't want to be on the nose, because when you're on the nose, you disengage the emotions. And so when we talk about the structure of a story, there's a number of things that we do to cause the protagonists or other main characters to falter or to have a weakness, and yet they see what the truth is, but they're not really quite sure what to do about it. And the audience, but the craft of the filmmaker and the storyteller is to make it evident enough so the audience sees what's supposed to be going on. I mean, typically movies start with an imperfect character, and the audience right off the bat says, boy, yeah, he's got a problem. He needs to change. And sure enough, by about 25% into the film, he goes on a journey that he's forced to go on, and that's a journey of transformation. It's all about character transformation. Well, the way that happens and where the audience transforms because they suddenly, you know, have got to work and figure out what has to happen, and so they're urging the characters on to do something, and so do certain things. And so when the characters do that, they may make a bad decision and suffer natural law consequences. And the audience subliminally says, "Okay, I don't want to do that." Right. And that's the benefit of showing tragedies at times, because there's Christian tragedies, right? And yet when the protagonist is something that's right and there's natural law good consequences, that resonates as truth in the audience. And they say, oh yeah, that's what I need to do in my life. Now they're not saying that literally.
Right.
You know, they're talking about the cool special effects. But they say, I get it, I like that.
They're absorbing it kind of.
Yeah, they're absorbing
unconsciously.
it.
Yeah.
And so this is the magic of myth, I think. And if I can try to define myth, because I think myth is misunderstood by a lot of people, especially by evangelical Christians, because they say, oh, it's a myth. So when we say Noah's a myth, well, what is not meant is that it's fiction.
Right.
Okay. J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. Tolkien led C.S. Lewis to Christianity. And part of that discussion, which you go on reading the essays and the stories of that, is that Tolkien was trying to convince Lewis that he had to embrace the myth of Jesus Christ. And Tolkien wasn't saying that Jesus was not true or didn't exist. And he finally says to Lewis, Lewis understood myth. And so think of Jesus as a myth. And he says, what do you mean? Well, the story of Jesus is a true myth, talking about the physical story. But what Lewis and Tolkien and those of us that are really in the film industry and in writing novels understand is that myth is the physical story on the top that we see, that we tell, that's on the screen, and the details don't matter. What matters is the underlying spiritual and moral motivations of the characters that we see metaphorically represented in the characters' lives and their consequences that they suffer or are rewarded with. And that points the audience to the underlying moral motivations of greed and generosity or justice versus mercy. And so a properly crafted story walks out. It's just a great myth when you walk out with that truth that you're holding on to. So myths are the physical stories that engender and imbue in them the truths that society wants to remember and pass down from generation to generation. Some of them are true in a physical sense, some of them aren't. But it doesn't really matter. And this is why we have to remind Christians at times when they see myths on the screen, whether it's a true myth or otherwise, that the details don't really matter. What matters is what I call the moral premise. What is the truth of the moral premise? What does this lead us to, and how do we apply this universally to our lives?